We've got a great program for you today, everybody, with Los Altos Development Services Director Nick Zornes. Let me start by introducing our guest. Uh, Nick has been I'll give you a brief bio. Nick has been an environmental planner with the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, helping build water infrastructure across the state. Planner for the city of Dana Point, California, planner for the city of Encinitas, where he was a part of the team that obtained the city's first certified housing element in over 2 decades, overcoming several land use challenges and regulatory barriers. Most recently, he was planning manager for Riverside County. Prior to his work in the public sector, Nick worked as a planning consultant and within the construction industry as a project manager. Nick holds a master's degree in community development from the University of Nebraska and a bachelor's degree in urban planning and sustainability from Arizona State University. Please join me in welcoming City Development Services Director Nick Zornes this morning and congratulating and thanking him and his team for all the hard work that led to an HCD certified housing elements. I'll begin with questions as mentioned earlier. Nick, for those not familiar with it, please explain what the housing element is and why it is important.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Nick Zornes, Development Services Director. Just a brief overview, just because I know many of the names have been on one of the calls, in the last almost year and a half since I arrived here at the city of Los Altos. So I don't want to kind of go too far into the weeds, but I'm just going to kind of give high level, just bullet points of what the housing element is. So a housing element is a required component of a city's general plan. Each city must plan for a fair share of housing. Now that's kind of another area and component of a housing element, but in summary is that every 8 years, all jurisdictions at a regional level meet with what is called their Council of Governments. Ours happens to be ABAG, so the Bay Area Council of Governments, essentially. And we get assigned from the state level a big pot of what our kind of considered regional need is for housing. Then from there, the jurisdictions, specifically with collaboration with ABAG, come up with what is determined to be the methodology for allocating specific numbers for housing to each individual jurisdiction in that local kind of what we call the COG, or the Council of Governments. So that's kind of where we're at while we have our 2,000 unit allocation that we have for the next 8 years. So like I said, is a housing element is required every 8 years. So right now we're in our 6th cycle housing element. And then this is something where if you hear saying the Housing and Community Development Department, that's HCD. That is essentially the state level version of the department that I oversee here at the city. But they are specifically tasked with the review and approval, or what we sometimes refer to as certification, which is what our city just obtained at the very beginning of September, is to review the housing elements for legal compliance with housing law in the state of California. So kind of just the high level, kind of just where we're at in the process is that on January 24th, 2023, or so earlier this year, the city, we did adopt our 6th cycle housing element by the statutory due date of January 31st. And then that put us into our formal review process with the state of California for them to provide us with what we call final concurrence, essentially. And so as a part of that, the state kind of looks and analyzes to make sure that all of the key components of a housing element, which is, did we address our housing needs assessment? What are our housing constraints in the city? What are some of the existing programs that we're reviewing? So really what that ends up doing is we look at predominantly what did we do in the 5th cycle and where are we at right now going into the 6th cycle? Housing resources, what do we have in the city or not, and identify where we either have kind of some of those resources or where we know we're lacking in certain resources. a site methodology and inventory, which is really kind of a really big meat and potatoes portion of the document, because that's essentially where you're saying you're going to plan for these housing units over the next 8 years. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, is also something that you'll hear us use interchangeably, and that is a newer requirement to housing elements, and something that really kind of changed and created an additional layer of complexity in this six cycle. And then really what the community's been in a buzz about the last couple of weeks for sure, is about what is our goals, policies, and the big one, programs of what are we going to do in order to achieve everything else that I just talked about over the next 8 years. So it's a pretty substantive document in regards to the amount of information, technical advice that's in there, the reconciliation of where we're at, what we've done, but where do we need to go. And so really it's a big culmination of all of those things into one document that's going to be our roadmap for the next 8 years to accommodate our fair share of housing.
Thanks, Nick, for the comprehensive summary. As this is in this sixth cycle, which runs from 2023 to 2031, what, if anything, is new and different this time around?
Sure. So there's, like I mentioned, the biggest change, at least as a planner and someone that actually worked on the fifth cycle housing element and a sixth cycle housing element in the same jurisdiction previously, is AFFH. So affirmatively furthering fair housing is the single biggest kind of change and meat and potato, like substantive. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I mean, it was just a big game changer because it added another level of complexity. So with that, for the most elementary explanation of what AFFH actually ends up doing, is it ends up saying is you have to affirmatively further the housing that you have, that you're going to have, and anything in the future policy wise that you're going to ensure that you peel back the layers on any type of exclusionary zoning, any type of known or unknown bias in regards to how you're going to accommodate housing, where you're going to accommodate that housing, and you need to make it fair and equitable for the access of that housing to all segments of the population. And so really what that ends up doing is making sure that you have a fair and equitable dispersion of those housing types throughout the community. So in full transparency and just practicality, what that means is, not as a planner, is for the residents, is that means jurisdictions essentially used to just say, all right, we are going to plan for housing only on El Camino Real. And that's it. We're not going to do anything else in the rest of the city because we do not believe as a jurisdiction we want to disrupt anything else in the city of Los Altos. So realistically, that's where we ended up having to then look at what is going on in the rest of the city, and looking at districts such as the CN district, which is along Foothill Expressway, look at downtown Los Altos, and really kind of evaluate, all right, well, we really don't have that much kind of bigger, lots, parcels, and, areas anymore other than our mixed use commercial zoning districts. So where can we accommodate that? And thankfully, we were able to have those. And so that was something that the state did agree on, is that was in substantial compliance with law, for us to be able to accommodate the housing needs throughout the city. But it used to be that people would concentrate it in one specific area and almost create that's going to be the enclave of affordable or special needs type housing. And that's no longer allowed. So that was a really big, significant change from cycle to cycle. One of the other really, I would say, kind of drastic changes was the language that was allowed to be used in the fifth to the sixth cycle. You used to be able to say things like, the city will evaluate and determine appropriateness of rezoning this parcel for this many units over the next 8 years. So taking that same type of concept, it now is the city shall rezone this parcel by this specific date. We will then also specifically fund it by general fund or a specific grant, or you have to actually make it extremely explicit in exactly how the city's going to do it, when the city's going to do it, where they're going to do it, who's going to do it, and how you're going to pay for it. So the where, the when, the why, the who, all of those kind of old fundamental things that we talk about, when we're writing something, that's really kind of now what we're held to the fire on. And it's to be able to provide a level of certainty as well as a level of accountability when the state is looking at, well, why hasn't anything actually manifested in the jurisdiction yet? Because now they have a certain level of expectation from obviously having gone through this 5 other times to know that some of those previous practices of not actually providing certainty and a level of guarantee in the document really wasn't rendering and producing housing units in the previous years. So that's really also the other big change in language. And I can tell you from working on a 5th cycle and 6th cycle back to back in one jurisdiction, that was actually something where we got adoption and then moved a year and a half later to then going to the 6th cycle, and the same programs we were having to essentially scrape and rewrite the entire thing to actually provide that total different way of explaining what we're going to do, to being the should or the will to the shall, which means a level of guarantee for the state.
Massive changes. The next question that has come up around town is, why did the CHD approve the Los Altos housing element on the 3rd try and not on the first, on Los Altos' first or second try?
Right. So I actually am going to somewhat just also further clarify. So really the state, I've been going through an iterative process with the state of California since January of this year. So just so that everyone on the call is understanding, is we submitted our first formal review to the state for review in August of last year. The first review is a 90-day review, and that's allowed by statute. We then got comments, we worked on it, we did our very best to be able to provide what we believe as a substantially compliant housing element when we submitted formally again in January after we adopted with the city council. So when we submitted to the state, they then get another 60 days, which then takes us to roughly the end of March. We then were found at that time to not be in substantial compliance again, which at that time, that was because there were some questions specific around some of our programs, some potential environmental concerns, so on and so forth. We resubmitted again at the very beginning of May. And at that time, we answered everything that was a part of the housing element at that time. And even some of our pro-housing advocates really were dismayed, just as I was when we received our letter from HCD at the end of June. And we kind of got some late hits of some further evaluation where they wanted us to further explain some of our sites that were included in the housing element. So from the month of July was a pretty rigorous time for myself, is that I had to look at all 200 sites for that are included in the housing element, and look at every single parcel data for all permit history for any type of building permits that have been pulled, requested, denied, expired, anything for the last 30 years in order to be able to further justify what has or hasn't been done on a site beyond just the typical evaluation points. And so with that review, it was really rigorous to be able to provide all of that data, but we were able to do it. So then we actually did a fourth informal review beyond just the three that are kind of the big ones that everyone knows about, and met with HCD directly and discussed exactly what we were providing as a way to be able to hopefully pass the last, test. They gave us some initial indications that said that they thought that that was suitable. And then 2 weeks after that, we formally submitted to the state. And then 2 weeks after that, we actually received final concurrence from the state and were certified. So actually, we really almost went through 5 review cycles, 3 of which were the longer statutorily allowed dates. And then 2 essentially informal, quicker, more expedited reviews. So with that being said, is one of the reasons why is that the state, every time they get their chance to review the document, they are reviewing it for what they believe is substantial compliance with housing law. That's a little bit obviously subjective, is because what does the substantial compliance mean? But because they've been reviewing so many housing elements for the last few years, so that everyone also further understands, Southern California, they actually had to start doing their 6 cycle housing element 2.5 years ago. So they've been doing this now for, it's going to be at the close of this year, 3 years of looking at what the expectation is with the 6 cycle housing element. And so that was one of those things that it was each time when they looked at it, they're further refining and making sure that our language, as well as essentially our statistics and our facts, are accurate. And we had to further justify and be able to provide them with the level of certainty of what we are going to do in order to be able to create the regulatory framework and environment for the development to potentially occur over the next 8 years. So that's really kind of the blend of the big picture of all of the things that over the 5 times that we had to interact with HCD, is what we were actually doing to accomplish was the multi-prongs of, different issues that were brought up by the state.
Thanks, Nick. What precisely has the city committed to implement the housing element, and what is the timeline for implementation?
So that one's kind of a bigger one that I'm probably not going to be able to answer all of it. But so in a nutshell is we have to rezone sites that are going to allow for residential or mixed use development in pretty much anything that's already zoned mixed use or commercial in the city of Los Altos. That does not mean that the development has to be standalone residential. It could still, and I think would actually be a really good development prototype for the city of Los Altos, is the mixed use. But inevitably, one of the things, and this is just an overarching kind of thing that needs to be kind of communicated and kind of a part of the conversation, is in Los Altos, we were actually the first jurisdiction I've actually worked for where we haven't had to do a true, what I would say, black and white rezoning, where we're essentially, didn't have to take land like some jurisdictions do and have to take it from like a commercial logistics type of a zoning district and turn it into a residential only zoning district. Really, our rezoning in the city of Los Altos was, all right, we already have downtown zoning districts that allows for mixed use. We just need to implement some of our previously discussed and determined height allowances. So for example, things like in the downtown vision plan, the increased height for buildings, we need to take those height recommendations, and now that's a certainty that's in our document that says we will create an increased height limit for X, Y, and Z in our downtown zoning. But that doesn't mean that we actually were changing the allowed uses. As it relates to the commercial neighborhood zone, the commercial neighborhood zone has always allowed for residential to be developed in it. But we needed to remove things such as the floor area ratio limitation, and then also allow for an increased height limit. And that's in order to be able to create the regulatory environment or the the land use incentives essentially for development to occur. And so that's really kind of where we're at with a lot of the kind of the quote unquote rezones. And then there's also just a certain level of kind of what I would almost reference as, yes, they are considered zoning amendments. But you know, things such as like our conditional use section is that there's a lot of outdated, inconsistent language, and we've found that throughout various sections of our code, even if it doesn't explicitly relate to the housing element implementation. And so that's really is every time we open up a chapter is we need to essentially look at, all right, is this language consistent? One, with law, obviously that's very important for us to be consistent with. But then two is this what the community actually wants in today's environment? But also, is it actually practical for how we actually need to enforce and apply the code? And so really those kind of three main things is really what the housing element ends up doing is implementing regulatory environment to allow for housing to occur or specifically mixed use, and be able to provide a level of streamlined review and certainty with when those applications do come in order to be able to allow for it to actually happen.
Thanks, Nick. There's been a lot of concern expressed and misinformation shared about the inclusion of Rancho Shopping Center as a potential site for more housing. What in your opinion is the reality?
So the reality is, and something that I have said at 2 public meetings, is the Rancho Shopping Center and the property owner have not come to the city of Los Altos and requested a meeting about the property. They have not submitted any documents for a development at all. And so that is the single biggest misconception and misinformation that has been in the community for at least the last 3 to 4 weeks. Additionally, the CN district, which is what Rancho Shopping Center is zoned, already allows for commercial and housing uses on that site and in that district specifically. What we provided in the housing element and has been in the housing element ever since the first public review draft was released in June of 2022, so over a year ago, was the removal of the floor area ratio limitation at the Rancho Shopping Center. And so that was something that was, as a back understanding, is that has not always existed at the Rancho Shopping Center. And in 1989, the city council took action, which quote unquote, what is in the meeting minutes from that final action meeting was the intent was to controlling future commercial growth at Rancho Shopping Center. It was not limiting or hindering residential uses on the site. It was only to control further proliferation of additional commercial uses on the site. So even the intent of that FAR limitation was not anything to do with housing. So that's a really important key is that one, housing is actually already allowed at Rancho Shopping Center, and two, the FAR was only put on as a restriction to in order to limit the commercial uses of the site. So additionally, some of the things that are important to understand is that the age of the structure, the improvement to land value, and the acre size of the lot are 3 categories that meet the state guidance that is published by HCD, that all 3 of those make it a site that is suitable to be on the housing element inventory. So that's actually a big triggering point as to why it would have been included. Additionally, there's 2 things that I want to kind of also touch on about the Rancho Shopping Center is that in the housing element, there's 2 different numbers for all sites, and there's the maximum unit yield, which is the maximum number under the general plan, which would be allowed, which for this site, it's 237. And then what would be considered the realistic unit calculation, which is 82 units. So when the city was calculating our housing element for the reliance of specific sites, We specifically created, obviously, what we have to is what's your maximum unit yield, but then really we have to then whittle away with, all right, there's the potential for redevelopment, but then there's also the potential that some of the site might not want to be redeveloped because of the property owner might wanting to retain parts of the building and the uses that are established there already. So with that, as well as then because there's surface parking specifically, the city did not account for the entire 6 acres as a part of its base calculation for the realistic unit calculation. So we really were trying to be conservative by saying that we actually think that the unit yield will probably be somewhere around 82 units for the site, in order to be able to accomplish development with a level of certainty. Now, yes, could the development be at the full maximum capacity? That is 100% a possibility, but that is a possibility under today's zoning, even if the rezoning doesn't happen, because that's what is allowed under today's general plan. The housing element is not actually increasing the allowed density for Rancho Shopping Center or the commercial neighborhood district. We are not amending the land use element, which is what dictates density. We are only amending things in the zoning code, which are a further limitation and restriction on development, which is exactly what the housing element is designed to remove those barriers for the creation of housing. So there's a lot of misinformation of all of those things that I just talked about that's kind of been blended together. But those are the facts of what, if you were to pull the documents yourselves and find all of the information on.
Thanks so much. That was in my opinion, a great comprehensive explanation and clarification of what's actually going on there. In addition to rezoning, what is the city doing to encourage housing development, such as reducing barriers to construction, reducing permitting complexity, et cetera?
Yeah, so there's been a few things that have already started to increase essentially what I would just say streamlining the housing development process. So late last year, actually, before we even submitted formally to the city or to the state of California, we already had included a program that said that we were going to hire specifically a planning division staff member in order to review ADU permits for compliance to be able to streamline those permit requests. Because for all transparency purposes, the city was out of compliance when I arrived at the city last year in May, and we're not reviewing accessory dwelling unit permits in the requirements that are required under the statutes, which is essentially 60 days or less. We were not meeting that target for something that is considered a ministerial permit, or something that essentially old school, what we used to refer to as you could kind of get it over the counter. It's not quite that simplified, but it is, for all extents and purposes, a very simplified permit. And we weren't meeting that. Well, we moved pretty steadfast. I played around with my staffing budget and everything, and actually was able to bring on that staffing or that staff person last year in October. So we've actually been streamlining that process for, in about a month from now, it's actually going to have been a year. And we've seen amazing, really good numbers. We were having quite a bit of complaints from some of our, what I would say, ADU partners, or people that are building ADUs actively within the city. And some of those people have become some of our biggest supporters because they've really appreciated the streamlined review process and actually getting some of those permits issued and back out to the clients, and obviously the people that are inevitably going to be living in the units. But also, as a part of that, is in earlier this year, which are some big things. As a part of the housing element, we actually said and committed the city we were going to eliminate the requirement for story poles. That has already been accomplished. We no longer have a design review commission in order to further streamline the process. We have created objective design standards in our code, which for all extents and purposes were things that the commission had previously in years past been enforcing because we actually didn't have them adopted yet. So they were using the discretionary process to actually implement those topics. So that was another really big accomplishment. Previously, also, the city council used to take final action on design review permits. The city council no longer reviews any design review permits for final approval. That's something that stops at the planning commission as they take final action on those. So again, providing another significant level of certainty to housing developments when they are applied for. And then some of the things that we're actually working on already is we're working on a comprehensive fee study for all development fees in order to make sure that we don't have anything that's out of date for good or for bad, and make sure that everything is, up to date for what that market actually needs to yield. And overall, what this has done is it's streamlined the process both internally, but obviously externally, and it's actually started to create faster timelines for review. And that's actually ultimately one of the biggest accomplishments that we have to look for all of our housing element programs.
Thanks, Nick. Also, it's I'm looking at the time here, and as this is such an important topic, I'm hoping you might be able to stay a little past 9:30.
Yep,
So
that's fine.
that would be great. It's become clear that many residents of Los Altos have never heard of the housing element or the various programs to be implemented. What is the city doing to educate residents and to correct misinformation about various aspects of the housing element that are swirling around the community?
So the first one, and like I say this to all community members, is and it's one of the reasons why I like working in a small jurisdiction, is my door is always open, my email is always on, and my phone is always next to me. So I am always available to talk to individual residents, small groups, larger groups, much like last night. Myself and city manager Gabe thought that we were going to be in a small group of maybe like 10 or 15 residents, and we ended up being in the Grand Oak Room at the Civic Center with 70 residents that wanted to understand what was going on because, about half the room said that they had never heard about what was going to happen at the Rancho Shopping Center or anything to do with the housing element. So with that is, everything that we do when it comes to a public action ends up being published in the town crier. We obviously have it on our city's website. I'm always available. And anytime, people need, more information, Mary and Joe both reached out to me, in order to ask me if I was, able to come and participate today. And I look to be able to do more community meetings and everything, as the community needs on certain topics. And the game of telephone is never fun for any topics, but that's one of the reasons why I make myself available to be able to provide the factual information. Because like I even joked around last night is, when people thought that there's been an application submitted into the city, I welcome a public records request because I can tell you that there's not going to be anything submitted for the Rancho Shopping Center, and that's just something that would end up being. So everything I do is as public and transparent as we need to, and I make everything available to the residents as well as myself. So anytime someone needs a one-on-one or a small group conversation, I'm available for that, and we will do whatever the community needs in order to be able to help further educate and provide an understanding of what we are doing in the process and how we need to move forward. But like last night, I think is a really good representation of how we're going to further try and educate the community. And even today, this morning, as we talk, is another good example of what we're doing here in Los Altos.
Thanks, Nick. The downtown parking has always been a big concern in Los Altos. The city council recently authorized a consultant to conduct a parking study downtown as required in the housing element update. Can you share any details about what the consultant will be doing? I know that it's at the beginning stage, but can you share more details about what the consultant will be doing and when?
Yeah, so like we just said, is just a week and a half ago, we just authorized the city to execute a contract with WTrans, which is actually a very large firm that does these types of plans. They've recently done a plan or are doing a plan right now for Sonoma and also for Gilroy, very similar to what we are actually looking for them to do here. They're going to be looking at, what is our actual parking capacity? What's the actual the flow of parking? So not necessarily circulation of the roadways, although that will be somewhat of a component of everything. But I think we all can say is, there's even myself as the development director that looks at zoning maps all the time, is sometimes I end up in a parking lot and I'm like, oh, I'm going the wrong way in our downtown plaza, just because sometimes the little bit of the flow and the circulation of the actual lots aren't correct. But so they're going to look at what is actually our capacity, what is actually going to be the need and the demand today and tomorrow, so in the future as well, and kind of be able to provide us what are our options from a true parking capacity and projections determination, as well as from that transportation engineering kind of component, and give us all of that factual information to be able to have. So I think that's kind of there's the overarching, and then there's been a lot of great work that's happened in years past and a lot of good documented history about traffic counts and about parking usage, which is actually really great statistical data that usually jurisdictions don't have that much as a framework to then guide the future kind of transitions to further support what we're going to do. So they'll kind of do a big comprehensive overview of what everything is, of where we've been, where we're at, and where we need to be. So all three components of looking past, present, and future. So that's kind of the bigger picture of that project.
Great. One last question before I open it up to the all the attendees here. Does the builder's remedy project proposed for First Street still have life given the certification of the housing element?
So yeah, so I'm gonna clarify kind of an overarching statement. So if a city, so it's not just Los Altos, this is any city. So by law, if a city does not have an adopted and certified housing element at the time, so that's the key, is at the time that a builder's remedy application is submitted, then the builder's remedy is valid and lives on for as long as it is an active project in the city. Now, there's always the potential that their application could expire because, like, let's say they just submit and then you never move forward. It doesn't live on in perpetuity forever. But if they do all of their due diligence of submitting their documents and continue to moving through the process, that permit request lives on until they are granted the approvals formally at the very end of the finish line. So I know there's a lot of other jurisdictions in the state of California that are trying to fight that, oh, now we have a certified housing element, it doesn't, that application doesn't apply, and that is not, it's just not factual. So that being said, is the city did receive one builder's remedy on First Street, and that permit will be valid and will have to be reviewed as such, as if we as if it was allowed. So that is the truth, and that's the meat and potatoes. However, before we open it up, I'm gonna build on one quick thing, just since we have so many different diverse people on here that I didn't see some of these folks yesterday. So it's a good opportunity. The city has had a certified housing element for just over 2 weeks. If the city does not implement the housing programs as adopted, the city will be found to be in non-compliance and would receive a notice of violation. So the state gives you, or HCD gives you, essentially a warning notice, and that's what they call your NOV, or your notice of violation. They give you essentially, the last time I received one, it was 30 days to come into compliance. So very quick, and that's super quick in order to be able to also meet your meeting due dates for public hearings and everything. So if we were to take action or not take action on something that is required, you get pretty much usually about 30 days. If you're lucky, 60 days. And then if you do not do what is said to be done in your notice of violation, your housing element is decertified. So if an element is decertified, you are open immediately to builder's remedy, and that means there's a zoning vacation for the entire city. So the only thing that is your line of defense during a zoning vacation or builder's remedy means that whatever density is adopted and allowed in the land use element is the only thing that is a limitation on development when someone submits in. So that's your essentially your base density calculation. But any development standards that's in your zoning code, the zoning code goes away essentially the entire time that you are in builder's remedy or a decertified housing element. So those are just practicality, and that's where it is very important for us to be able to maintain compliance. And the way that you do that is by implementing the housing element programs that we've already adopted. So that's kind of the bigger picture on what builder's remedy actually ends up being for the community.
Thanks for that clarification. I doubt that that is in the public knowledge. And, you just, in my opinion, you just clarified a swirling controversy about what would happen going forward. So thanks for jumping in, and making that clear to everybody here. I'm now going to open it up to the attendees. Please use the reaction button to raise your virtual hand, and I'll call in order. First up is Ann Paulson.
Hi, Nick. So last
Hi.
week you talked about possibly incentivizing some certain areas that we have on the housing element to include retail by giving them some sweeteners. Well, a little more about that, such as which areas would be appropriate for such a thing?
Okay, Anne, you kind of broke out, but I think I know which topic you're talking about. Is just as incentivizing mixed use development in some of the zones, essentially, from what I talked about last night, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So everyone knows that wasn't in attendance as last night there was the community meeting at the community center, and one of the questions that kind of was, well, what can we do as a community to incentivize some of our existing essentially commercially developed properties that are zoned commercial neighborhood, for the specific example that was brought up, in order to be able to incentivize the developer to build out mixed use development instead of just standalone commercial or standalone residential. Really is what can we do to sweeten or finesse the regulatory environment, essentially. And so also, for full transparency, is I was just at the state planning conference Saturday through Tuesday morning down in Fresno, and actually was speaking on the housing elements at at the conference on Monday. And one of the things that one of the other panels at another session was talking about was actually, how do you create essentially the transition from commercial development to mixed use residential developments. There was also a session that really specifically spoke to the transition from discretionary review to ministerial review. And so those are kind of like two sessions in one of really exactly what was brought up last night. And really kind of some of the big takeaways of honestly what it was, without sugarcoating it, is a reduction in impact fees as a possibility of being able to really incentivize mixed use development. A reduction or elimination of parking for mixed use development as a and just so that everyone knows, because I know that everyone would balk at that. And it is scary, even as a planner, because that's one of the big things that planners, no matter what type of development is, we always are looking at it. It's like the first level of, okay, well, can you even build this because of parking? Is that truly what we have seen in the last 10 years in California, but also in development, is developers are going to provide what we consider market-based development parking. So especially if you talk to a commercial developer or a commercial realtor, everyone's going to tell you, you have to build a certain level of parking. Otherwise, that commercial component of your building will not lease. No one will lease a building unless a site has commercial parking available for it. So there really is kind of that on the back end where developers are going to provide what they know they need in order to lease the spaces. And they wouldn't build it because the level of investment is so significant. So those kind of two big components. And then there's also the other one is that we will give you a by right height increase if you do mixed use. So essentially incentivizing additional height for mixed use development, but not incentivizing it for just commercial development. So you don't just do it as that it's a blanket for all type. And that's actually, if you were to look at specifically like the commercial neighborhood zoning district amendments that I put forward 2 weeks ago at the Planning Commission, that's essentially how I structured it, is commercial or non-residential land use would be allowed the 30 feet in height that they're allowed today under zoning. If it was to be residential only, they get 40 feet. So the 10 feet increase that we are allowing under zoning, or that we're allowed or required under the housing element. And then if you want to do mixed use development, you get 45 feet. So you get an extra 5 feet on top of all of it so that you can kind of get that regulatory kind of environment that they're looking for and incentivize it for that type of development. And then again, kind of going back to anytime you're going to want to have mixed use or commercial development, it is going to be higher than or residential only. It has to be. And I think anybody that's a property owner, developer, or realtor in commercial, everyone knows your ground floor uses that are traditionally commercial, obviously in a mixed use development, has to have usually anywhere between 20 to 30% extra headspace, essentially, so floor to ceiling height for that type of use, because of the type of equipment and the type of lighting, the type of fixtures, anything that we all see in today's type of environment. So then you're looking at those three main things: fees, parking, and height. And those are the three main incentives that you can do that actually end up helping to influence and quote unquote incentivize the development.
Thank you, Nick. Sue Russell.
Yeah, hi, Nick. So following up on that, then you talked along the same lines of what if somebody asked for the density bonus, and that's where I got a little bit lost, because I thought you said that then it becomes discretionary and not by right, but then you talked about Los Altos having the on-menu options, one of them being the extra 11 feet in height, and I wasn't clear whether that became discretionary or whether it was still by right from your answer, because that would lead to 56-foot height limit, which I think was concerning to a lot of the people there.
So density bonus will always still be somewhat of a discretionary action by a city, because it's something that's not 100% codified in regards to exactly what could be requested under concessions, incentives, or waivers under the density bonus law. However, the city, what Sue's referencing is that the city, and I believe it was in 2020 is the last time or 2021, I think is the last time we updated the housing element, housing density bonus ordinance. And we allow for what's called a quote unquote on menu concession for height. So we allow where you can request a 11-foot height increase that's in our code, and essentially then we just don't talk about it at all, because we've said we're going to allow you to do an 11 feet increase, and essentially that's just, it's a streamlined process. And a lot of cities are starting to move into that direction so that you create a level of certainty again for the developers. Now, the thing is though, is that when you have someone requesting density bonus, the true final action and approval authority does have to go through a discretionary public hearing. But if someone were to request density bonus that's an on-menu concession, it's really just if that's the only request that they're doing, and then they comply with all of their standards and they're not going to request any other waivers or concessions, it's really just a public hearing, and it's just a part of the process because everything else is ministerial or by right. So it's really kind of just a staff report that's just memorializing the approval, because that final action has to be done at the planning commission level. So it is still a streamlined process if someone used the on-menu concession. However, density bonus law and the case law behind it has become very significant, where if there is something else that needs to get waived, the city does have to allow for it. But like I kind of mentioned last night at the other community meeting, is density bonus is not a part of the equation when we look at what we're doing in our local code. That has, and I can tell you, it's been an argument that I've had to have with the state, with multiple land use attorneys and also jurisdictions, is that everyone knows that density bonus exists, but density bonus was a first first attempt to create the regulatory environment for developers to be able to get what they need from a jurisdiction, but it still has proven to not provide enough certainty, where the development community and property owners are needing it to be in the code to be able to essentially hold jurisdictions accountable, that these are the things that we said we're going to do. These are the things that are available to you by our local ordinance, not just state law. And one of the things that we actually just talked about at the state planning conference is that density bonus is if you create the regulatory environment to incentivize density bonus, or incentivize developers in your local ordinance, there have been significant areas, so specifically Long Beach and San Diego, that have not seen state density bonus law applied on a lot of their projects because they don't need it anymore. The developers are using the local ordinance in order to deploy their prototypes of commercial or mixed-use development, or residential or mixed-use development, without the need of state density bonus law. So it's kind of a little bit of a complexity that it's like, well, if you do this, you get that type of a scenario. So it's kind of a trade-off of which is going to be inevitably the better kind of, I guess, toolbox for someone to utilize. Oh, Dave, you're muted.
Thanks, Nick, for the clarification on that. Before we answer any more questions, I know some of you may need to leave. It's already a couple minutes past 9:30. I just wanted to make a few announcements. Our next meeting will be on Friday, October 6th from 8:30 to 9:30. Please join us for an overview of Los Altos School District with Jessica Spicer, Board President, and Sandra McGonigal, Superintendent. If you would like to be added to the LACC mailing list, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. This email is posted in the chat for your convenience. A big thank you to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. I don't see any other hands raised. Does anybody have any additional questions for Nick? Nick, I think that's a commendation of how thoroughly you covered the questions that have all been swirling around the community. Everybody, please join me in thanking Nick for a great discussion today. And we will look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. And thanks for Nick for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and a good weekend.